So what type of sword would modern people carry if sword wearing was common? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and this is a genuinely short, hopefully, follow-up to my previous video talking about the considerations for deciding or trying to work out what modern people would wear in the modern world if in a particular area or country or state sword wearing became fashionable again. Now understandably that was a very long and detailed and hopefully thought-provoking video, but some people were frustrated that I didn't name specific types of sword that I thought definitely would or definitely wouldn't be carried in the modern world. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do here very briefly. Hopefully in that video I was clear that it's actually an incredibly complex question, that it's very difficult to predict because there are cultural factors, fashion elements that would come into it that we can't really predict. So for example, it could be that everyone would end up wearing katanas purely for fashion or style reasons, and that's outside of the considerations really of this channel and outside of the ability for me to predict. But what I can do as a fencing instructor and collector and seller, purveyor of antique weapons is kind of predict what swords out of the ones that currently exist may or may not be the chosen weapons for people to wear today for purely practical and fighting reasons. So in a nutshell, what most people are going to want to carry is something that is easily carryable, gives a reach advantage if possible, gives good hand protection, and is relatively easily wieldable. Okay, now all of those things will lead us to different conclusions, and it depends where the balance of those things lie as to which sword we'd end up with. If we look at a combination of hand protection and reach, we're going to end up with a rapier, basically. Perhaps a basket-hilted broadsword or something like that, perhaps even a saber. But generally speaking, and this was my conclusion before when I did this video years ago, or this topic years ago, was a rapier because of reach, nimbleness of the point, and hand protection. However, rapiers are not particularly easy to wield. They're actually relatively heavy. They can weigh as much as 1,300 or even more grams. So they're heavier than a saber is, and they're more in the realm actually of a lightish longsword. So they're not particularly easy to wield, and they require, to be used effectively, a certain amount of training, which people in the modern world might not necessarily be up for. Now for ease of wieldability, we could look at something like the longsword, which has a two-handed grip, and therefore more people can use it more easily because they apply both of their hands to it and use leverage, and you get a lot of power into it. However, these are just as inconvenient to carry around as something like a rapier is. So for ease of carry, we might end up with some form of short sword. Should also mention briefly as well, the longsword has crap hand protection compared to swords with more developed hilts that came along in later periods. If for practicality reasons people went for a short sword, then they could still have decent hand protection on it and still have a blade that was moderately long and good for general self-defense purposes, and would still be effective for cut and thrust and things like that, but it'd be a lot easier and lighter in many cases to carry around. But then we come back to the same old problem as if you've got a short sword but someone else has got a rapier, they're going to have a length advantage over you. And for anyone who's ever sparred rapier against short sword, it's extremely difficult. It is a really significant disadvantage in an unarmoured context where there's no shields, no bucklers, there's no offhand weapons, it's just a primary sword. So we're back at rapiers again, but I do think that we would probably end up with rapiers, but they wouldn't be the longest rapiers around. People would probably be going for rapiers that are somehow more manageable to walk around with, get in and out of cars with potentially, and public transport or that kind of stuff, going up and down stairs. So I think we'd probably end up with something akin to a rapier, relatively light but not as long as the longest rapiers, probably a blade somewhere in the region of maybe 35 inches, something like that. So you're still going to outreach most other one-handed swords that people might choose. You can match the reach of a longsword, you've still got hand protection, but it's balanced fairly close to the hand and is fairly wieldable. So there we go. I think we'd end up back with the rapier again if sword carrying was completely common. But as mentioned in my previous video, we might end up with modern materials. So we might end up with a handguard, for example, made of modern materials in a new design. But just looking at traditional swords that have actually existed in history, I think we'd end up with some form of rapier with a swept hilt or a cup hilt, something like that. Good level of hand protection, and probably some degree of cutting capacity, I think, because most people want that from a sword. And in fact, if you're going to use a sword purely as a thrusting weapon with minimal cutting ability for that blade, I think that's more difficult for more people to do and requires more training. So actually, I think they probably get a cut and thrust blade that's relatively slender, obviously pointy, moderate length with decent hand protection, ergo some kind of rapier. But hold on a second there. As I was editing this video, I had another way of looking at this topic, which as briefly as possible I would just say is indoors or confined spaces. And the simple fact is, in the age of rapiers in the 16th and 17th century, they were used outdoors. People spent a lot of time outdoors. If they were going to have a fight, they generally had it in the street. If you were indoors, you didn't normally wear your rapier necessarily, and you didn't normally fight with your rapier as your primary weapon. You might have a rapier and dagger. You might use your dagger, for example, or indeed some form of short sword. So in the modern world, depending on where you live and what type of lifestyle you have, if you're spending most of your time indoors or in vehicles, for example, that completely changes it. And in that situation, short swords might be way more popular. Okay, not just are they easier to carry, but they're also way easier to use as weapons indoors. For home defense, a rapier is not a great choice. For home defense, something like a wakizashi. Even in the 19th century, there are manuals that talk about this. And moreover, not only shorter in stature, but a less complicated guard. This has two advantages. Number one, you can get to it and deploy it more quickly. Secondly, the guard is less likely to get in the way or get tangled with anything, and you can wear it close to your body. So in actual fact, maybe wakizashis or something very, very similar like a da or something like that would be hugely popular for another set of reasons. Oh, this is so complicated. So there we go, that's my conclusion. What do you think? What do you think people would carry if sword carrying was completely normal? And you know, occasionally you might have to use it for self-defense or a duel or anything like that. So you might use it. It's not just something you wear, but it's something you occasionally have to use or might have to use, at least mentally be prepared to use. What type of sword do you think, not necessarily would you carry, because you know, I might carry a saber or I might carry a longsword. Irrelevant, what do you think most people would end up carrying? I think it would be a form of modest length rapier. Cheers for watching and see you back on the channel soon. Cheers folks.